All right, I'm going to go through four more compositional ideas that have to do with the rectangle and creating a sense of unity or connectivity in a composition. And the first is the notion of repetition. So when you repeat things within the rectangle, the effect is that it allows the viewer to get the sense that things sort of obviously belong together because you have like elements together with one another. So it's a really powerful connective device or unifying device when you repeat, whether you repeat a shape or repeat, in terms of form, repeat a round shape or repeat an angular shape, or in terms of subject matter, if you have, one person and you repeat it with another person. Again, the effect is that it makes things feel like they belong together a little bit more. So there's a difference though between just straight repetition. So here, if I have a rectangle and I just have all circles and they're all about the same size, that's a repetition, but it's kind of like wallpaper. It's just sort of boring. There's not much interesting about it. So when you repeat things, repeat with the idea that you're going to repeat with variety. So in this drawing, I've got a number of rounded forms, but they're different sizes. I've also thrown in a couple of repeating angular shapes. And a lot of times when you, if you want to highlight something like a particular color or a particular element, you can highlight it by putting in its opposite. So I don't make things look rounder. Like if my interest was in showing round shapes, I don't make the viewer kind of feel them more by making them all the same size and having nothing opposing those shapes. But by having a couple of angular shapes against those rounded shapes, it actually makes the rounded shapes seem rounder. So with variety, you can kind of intensify the feeling of any particular shape that you want to highlight or subject matter. Or color, like if everything is red in a composition, the red starts losing its meaning. But if you have some green to offset it, which is its complement, then that red seems even more powerful or vibrant. All right, so the idea of repetition, repeating, an obvious one, but again, a very powerful unifying device. The second is balance, and this talks about like the whole, everything that's within the picture plane. What kind of balance are you creating? And there's two basic kinds that you see in drawing books. There's symmetrical, and this is an example of that. The idea being that, and this works both horizontally and vertically, if I divide the canvas in two, is essentially the same thing happening on the left as happening on the right, or the two like equally balancing one another. And again, it's best to have symmetry with variety, not absolute symmetry the way I have here, but I could have two trees over here and one over here, and it would still be essentially symmetrical, right? So this is asymmetrical. This is when you have sort of a different proportion of visual weight on the two sides. So here I've got a lot more visual weight on this side, but it's balanced by the smaller visual weight on the right side simply because of placement. So I don't always have to have like a 1-to-1 ratio in terms of how I'm balancing the canvas. It's just, and a lot of times it's a lot more, the asymmetrical will give you something a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more, not unbalanced, but just a little less regular. So you see a lot of like Renaissance compositions when you want things to feel very stable and quiet, like a mother and child. Will have an essentially symmetrical composition, whereas, something like a martyrdom of a saint where they want to create a lot of intensity and a lot of anxiety, it may be a more asymmetrical kind of composition that they choose. So the idea is to go back again, like this should relate ideally to what you're trying to express. All right, so we'll ignore this one. All right. So the idea of proportion, and by proportion I mean just like the amounts of things in a composition. So you always want to kind of stay aware of how much of like elements you're putting together. So that has to do with shape, with tone, with color. So with this simple composition, how much light versus how much dark is in the composition? Because that's going to have an impact on the feeling of your drawing. If it's much more weighted to the dark side than if it's much more weighted to the light side versus a middle value, whatever it is, just keep track of the amounts. Or the amounts of rounded objects versus hard-edged objects, because again, that's going to contribute to the feeling of the drawing. If you've got mostly angular shapes, then it's going to be something, it's going to have a very different feeling than if most of the shapes are rounded. So, but again, you don't want all of one, none of the other. You're trying to sort of strike a balance based on your idea. But the idea is to keep track of the amounts. And it's the same thing when you get to color and painting, is how much of my principal compositional colors I might have, like a dominant color, a secondary color, a tertiary color, how much of each am I putting into the composition. And it's just a way of sort of controlling the whole again, sort of always being aware of what's happening and making sure that you're in charge of all of these important elements that you're putting into your composition. The other thing I'm going to mention with this illustration is the idea of negative shape. So usually when we're composing, we're thinking about the subject matter and the positive shapes that they represent in the rectangle. But when you put them on a flat surface, there's also a negative shape that's created that has its own impact, and it's important to stay aware of what that is. And are you making interesting negative shapes as well as positive shapes? So it's a subtlety, but an important one, because when you think about it, this big two-dimensional puzzle that you're creating, the negative shapes are just as much a part of that puzzle as the positive shapes. So you want to stay aware of the kind of negative shapes that you're creating. Okay, and that's it. Those are the 4 for today.